Now, in looking at this transformational system, we have to address some serious questions. A great psychiatrist named Frantz Fanon and a great sociologist, E. Franklin Fraser, they both reached similar conclusions that in America, African culture was destroyed. Fanon put it in a profound sense. And if this is true, we shouldn't be walking or talking right now. He said, when the Black perception came in contact with the white perception, or the Black world came in contact and conflict with the white world and went under through colonialism and slavery, Blacks lost two things. And I have to use these words because they're very important. I'll explain them. He said they lost their ontology and their metaphysics. Ontology is your sense of being human. All human beings have a special sense of humanity. And some, you might say, barely have any at all. But they have a concept of what it means to be a human being. According to Fanon, Africans in the enslavement process lost, and the colonial process lost their sense of what it means to be human because they had bought into this savage narrative. He also said they lost their sense of metaphysics. Metaphysics means the first principles, the principles that govern life, the principles that govern the universe. Here's the deal about this. Fanon was a psychiatrist. He came from Martinique. And E. Franklin Fraser was a sociologist. He was trained at the University of Chicago. Now, there's two things to understand about Martinique and Chicago. Martinicans think they're French. They've been French fried. And Frantz Fanon in his first stage had been French fried. He later woke up. He married to a white woman. Now, let me just say this. Some very conscious Africans, like Sheikh Anta Diop, married to a white woman, but he didn't lose his consciousness. So get this straight. I'm not knocking everybody that marries white. And I'm not knocking Fanon either, but I'm simply saying that he was more susceptible to this idea that colonialism or slavery could knock out your sense of being human and knock out your deep thought, your so-called metaphysics, the deepest thoughts that come out of your culture, in part because of his background. And the University of Chicago is real good for producing people whose minds are white as snow. We had Raymond Wimbush on this show about 3 weeks ago talking about ADOS. And I made the comment, it was a joke, but it was serious. He got a PhD from the University of Chicago. I said, Raymond, that's a rare thing that someone would come out of the University of Chicago, Afrocentric minded like you. And then he said two words, Bobby Wright. Most of you don't know who he was. He was an African-American psychologist who was as conscious as they come. And so he was saved by having a classmate that kept him grounded. So they're asserting that in America, and many of you assert the same thing. You say, they took our culture in slavery. That's what you say. I go and speak to young kids all over the country. And when I ask them, how many of you think you have a culture? Hardly no hands go up. Because we've been fed a false narrative. The only way a people don't have a culture is if they get wiped out. As long as a people live, they will have a culture. The culture may undergo and always will undergo transformation. It'll undergo stress. It'll undergo strains, and it will definitely change. But generally, culture adheres to its fundamentals. So, can I prove this is wrong? First, I want to say that there's a lot of groundbreaking scholarship on this, but you don't have to be a scholar to know this. If you really know your people, you'll know that the African American is more African than even he realizes. Malcolm X made an observation in the Nation of Islam. He said, when you get below the surface of what he called the American Negro, there you will get to the heart and the soul of the African. And Malcolm was able to build the Nation of Islam by pricking in to that African sensibility, that African pride. So, but there are a body of scholarship that challenges this. The most important is Zora Neale Hurston, great Black anthropologist who did a lot of work on just looking at African-American culture and showing its African base. A man named Melville Herskovitz, a white man, who wrote a book called The Myth of the Negro Past and talked about how African culture is at the foundation of African-American culture. W.B. Du Bois had some of his best insights on African-American culture, showing its African base. Some very, very creative insights. And there are a host of other scholars, James Smalls, who comes out of South Carolina. So he didn't have to read a book to know that the culture he came out of is African, beautiful African. He knew that. And a host of others, and I'm one of those. In fact, I spend as much time looking at my people's culture as I do Africa. In fact, a little bit more time. Because I said before, it's a poor frog that won't praise its own pond. And it's a poor tree that doesn't respect its own roots. And it's a poor people that don't even have an appreciation of their foundation, of their essence. So if they're wrong, if Frantz Fanon is wrong, if Fraser and others are wrong, what's the proof? Well, let's take the Caribbean, first of all. A great historian, Caribbean historian, he's from Trinidad, Eric Williams, made the comment that when Africans were brought into the Caribbean, they dropped African culture there. They dropped it. And what he meant was the native people, the Native American people, had been exterminated throughout most of the Caribbean. And so these islands filled up 97, 98% African. And you had some slave managers, some slave overseers, but they were a distinct minority. And so in that environment, what's called a hybrid culture developed. Hybridity means it's the meeting of two dissimilar kinds of things, European and African, but the Africans stood largely whole, but influenced by this European thing. So if you listen to the speech patterns of Africans from the Caribbean, it's African-based. The vowel structure, the syntax is African-based. By the way, so is it here. 85% of Black people are Ebonic speakers, and that's a Niger-Congo Bantu linguistic system. It is not Black English. It's got a structure all its own. So in an environment in which Blacks are almost everybody, how do you lose your sense of being human? How do you lose your spirituality? And the best proof that you didn't is the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution is the only slave rebellion in the history of the planet Earth that succeeded in overthrowing enslavement. And how did they do it? They did it through drawing from the deep thought of African culture, the deep fundamental principles of African spirituality and what's called metaphysics. And they drew from the deepest sense of humanity. Those that launched that rebellion were voodoo priests. And their voodoo, which is all it means is God, it is the African spirit system that you call religion. There's no word for religion in any African language. So, but there is a word for prayer. There is a word for praise. And there is a word for spirit. And there is a word for praise. And in case you don't know it, when Black people worship in the Black church, they worship in an African way and often don't even know it. And that's a way coming straight out of Africa. So when Boukman, who was one of 7 Hogans who are priests of Africa, coming out of the Yoruba and other African spirit systems, because what happens in the Caribbean is where Catholicism exists, you're able to maintain African spirit systems, but they're mixed because you have Africans from different parts of Africa mixing together. So you have a Pan-African voodoo. It's powerful. And so the launching of that revolution, the success of that revolution, more than anything, was due first to the brutality of the French, but they were no more brutal than anywhere else. It was due to the fact that they piped into the deepest sources of African culture, to the origin ideas, and that gave them the power to defeat one of the best armies in the world. In fact, Napoleon Bonaparte, in terms of ground warfare in Europe, was the best fighter. Dessalines was better. Toussaint was better. The masses of Haiti were better. Why? It was their culture, baby. So far from losing this sense of being human, what they call ontology or metaphysics, the deepest metaphysics, African spirit systems. Let me tell you, where the Spirit of God possesses you and gives you information. That was the basis for the success of this revolution. And because that revolution was based on humanism, when other Africans rose up like Simon Bolivar and had to go and hide out in Haiti, the only thing the Haitians asked when they gave him support for his revolution was that they free their slaves. They carry out emancipation. And these Africans, the baddest Africans in the world, they're paying for it right now. Among the poorest. It's their price for having successfully defeated the European. And it's a price that we should make Europe pay through paying reparations to them as well as to us. And that we should use our strategic power to get the anvil off of the necks of Haitian people. So what about the American case? This is where they have their strongest argument, they think. Because in America, Africans were overwhelmed or outnumbered. Because unlike the Caribbean, where you could drop a majority of Africans into an island, whites were the majority here, though in South Carolina and Mississippi, we had large numbers, and in South Carolina, larger numbers than whites. And the most successful slave rebellion, or at least the best planned slave rebellion in the history of enslavement, the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion. It sent fear down the spines of whites. But the key point is that Africans in America faced a different situation. And that situation was one where Euro-Americans could carry out a full-scale attack on African culture, the likes of which Africans experienced nowhere else in the world. And so that is why a lot of people, historians, have concluded, and a lot of us have been given the false narrative, including from some of our own scholars, that slavery destroyed African American culture. And to do that, again, we'd have to go back to Fanon's point that, according to him, slavery and colonialism destroyed the ontology or sense of humanity, and the metaphysics or the deepest structure or deepest ideas in that culture, in African culture. So what is the case for that? The case for that is that it's dead wrong. As I said before, as long as the people live, their culture will continue to live. As we often say, you can take the African out of Africa, but you can't take Africa out of the African. Africa is deeply embedded in the African. We all talk about genetic memory, and we always use it to just refer to the trauma that comes out of slavery, that we had this memory of that. But if genetic memory extends to slavery, then doesn't extend 144,000 years back, because that's when the first human beings came into being. They were African. And these human beings, the Twa, gave birth to humanity. They gave birth to civilization. They gave birth to the idea of one God, who they did not see as a human being. So you have a deep structure. And so that structure is certainly genetic. But those, as I've mentioned this before, those who have gone to the other side talk about cellular memory, how God is embedded in our cells, a memory of our past. And so we can always explain the inferiority complex by slavery. But how do you explain the sharing, the humanity, the kindness, the love? How do you explain that? Dr. Siri McDougall was talking about how that was very basic to the African American, and I would say African people in general's conception of manhood. It was nurturing, and particularly it was not just providing food, and clothing, and shelter, and now both men and women do that, but it was providing love, nurturing, kindness. That's the African American's view of himself. And smart African American women know that when they're looking for a man, that's the kind of man they look for, who's intelligent and everything else, but kind. That comes out of your genetic and cellular memory, comes out of your history and your culture.